Alex Malpas is one of the leading opponents of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and recently, in a series of videos, he has been preparing for his debate with William Lane Craig. In parts of the videos, he also responds to my defense of the Kalam argument as well. So in this series of videos, this is the first part, I'm going to respond to some of the things that Malpas say in response to me. Now, I don't have time to respond to everything he says in his videos because his videos are actually very long. Each of them is about 2 hours or so. So I don't have the time to cover everything that he mentioned and most of the things he mentioned are actually addressed to Craig. And so I'm just going to focus on those parts where he tried to respond to my version of the Kalam argument. And I'm going to respond to those specific points, right? And to show why his objections against my defense don't work. Now, one of the key premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is the causal principle. The causal principle says whatever begin to exist has a cause. Why? Because something doesn't come from nothing. Okay, so if something begin to exist, it must have come from something causally prior. And I have offered a number of arguments to show that the causal principle is true. One of them is the modus tollens argument. And the other is the argument from the concept of non-being. And there are other arguments as well. But for today, let's just talk about the concept of non-being, right? Because this is the argument that Malpas criticized in his first episode of his preparation video. So let us first take a look at what Malpas has to say, and then my response.
And then he sort of, at the end of this passage, he says, now the concept of non-being is the absence of anything, no matter, no energy, not even the potential for anything. Therefore, it's metaphysically impossible that anything, whether the universe itself or anything in the phenomena or noumenal world, could begin to exist from non-being. All right, so remember in the 2022 book, he said that this was an argument for the causal premise, and this, I guess, is 2 sentences, and in the middle of them there is the word therefore, but it's not really an argument for the causal premise as such. I mean, the concept of non-being is the absence of everything. Okay, therefore it's metaphysically impossible that anything could begin to exist from non-being. Now that isn't an argument where the conclusion is the causal premise. The causal premise was everything that begins to exist has a cause. And it's not clear that this has that as a conclusion. So what we have to do is reconstruct some version of what's going on in this passage to be an argument for the causal premise, if that's what we're supposed to understand this to mean.
Okay, let's pause here for the time being. Now, Alex Malpas, he complains that what I have stated on the screen here is not quite an argument. Why? Because he thinks that...
Now that isn't an argument where the conclusion is the causal premise.
But however, it's quite clear that the conclusion, whatever begin to exist as a cause, does follow, right? I mean, the conclusion is that, therefore, it is impossible that anything, whether the universe itself or anything else, could have begun to exist from non-being. So that means that whatever begin to exist would have to come from some being, right? And which means that whatever begin to exist would have to come from something, and that something would be the cause for whatever begin to exist. And therefore, whatever begin to exist has a cause, right? So it is quite clear that the conclusion, the causal principle, does follow from what I have stated here. But anyway, because he failed to understand this, right? He tried to reconstruct my argument, and you find that his reconstruction is fallacious, right? It's based on misrepresentation, as I will now show.
A picture, yeah, okay. So imagine in this top row, you've got a state of affairs, this grey blob, and inside it a thing exists. Then later on, maybe it's done something to make new things exist, right? But in this bottom line, there's just sort of an empty state of affairs in which no things exist. And that just means that at any subsequent time, there's not going to be any things in there either. It's just going to be the same, because nothing can happen. Because in order for anything to happen, there needs to be something earlier that can make it happen, basically.
Okay, so after he explained this diagram. He then goes on to say,
I'm not actually committing to there being a state of affairs where no things existed, because that is to treat it like it's something called nothing in which there are no objects. And there's a sort of irony, which is that Loke and possibly Craig, but Loke's the one who's complaining about people like Krauss. He's saying they are not treating nothing nothingy enough. They're treating it too much like a something, whereas actually nothing is the absence of everything. But I say you're still treating it as a something by treating it as a kind of container in which there are no things.
okay, so notice what Alex is saying here. He is accusing me of treating nothing like something, like a container, right? But where in the passage I wrote did I assume that nothing is like a container? I mean, that is not what I said. When as I said earlier, what I mean by nothing is the absence of anything. Okay? Regardless of whether there is regardless of whether there is or there isn't a container, right? I'm not assuming whether there is a container or not. I'm just saying, when somebody say something comes from nothing, he's assuming that something began to exist in the absence of any causally necessary condition. Okay, so I'm not referring to a thing called nothing. That is based on Alex's misinterpretation of what I said, right? He was the one who drew the diagram with two circles, one is empty, and then he think that is what I'm trying to say, right? But that is not what I'm trying to say, right? I didn't say anything like that. So that is actually based on Alex's misinterpretation of what I said. Okay, so I'm not assuming whether there is or there isn't a container. I'm not referring to a thing called nothing, right? Rather, what I'm saying is that nothing is the absence of anything. And when we apply it to the beginning of the universe, right, when somebody says that the universe began to exist uncaused, right, they are saying that there is an initial state of reality and saying that there is an absence of anything prior to it. So Alex's objection is based on a misunderstanding. And let's continue to see what he has to say.
And then they're saying because the container doesn't have any things in it, the container is not going to turn into a container with things in it. But if we just shift the quantifiers around, I'm not committing to there being an empty container sort of before the universe exists. I'm just going to say something like, for everything that exists, isn't, for every causal condition or whatever, it's not antecedent to the universe. It's like posterior to the universe beginning to exist.
Okay, you have listened to what Alex means when he says for the universe, right, to begin uncaused. But what he says does not answer my argument at all. Recall that my argument is saying that in the absence of any causal conditions prior to the beginning of the universe, right, there'll be no potential, not even the potential for anything, right, for the universe to begin. And for Alex to say, well, for something to begin uncaused is for all the causal conditions to exist posterior, right, to the initial state of reality, does nothing to respond to my objection that in the absence of any potential for the universe to begin to exist, right, the universe wouldn't begin to exist at all, right? And so Alex's objection has not actually refuted my argument from the concept of non-being. Okay, it does nothing, right, to respond to my argument. Okay, so that's the end of this episode. And when I have time, I will make the next episode to respond to other parts of the series of videos that Alex is making.